Deformers are tools that you can use in Maya to change the shape of an object. And for that reason, they are useful both as modeling tools and animation tools. And there are some that are distinctly intended to be used in animation, such as joint and skeleton tools and blend shapes and things like that, because there are ways to animate them easily. But in some cases, you may want to use a deformer to change the shape of an object and to preserve that shape and not animate it. So let's go back to this reference head model. And the deformers, we can find them either under the modeling set, under deform here, and you'll see these under animation 2, and the same ones, same things. Let's keep our modeling options open. And we're really just going to look at two types of deformers. One is a lattice, and the second is a group of deformers called the nonlinear deformers. And there are a lot of other things here that we'll talk about the texture deformer too, because that's quite useful. Okay, so first let's just look at the lattice deformer. So if we go to deform, select this object, deform, create lattice, it just makes a box around the object and allows you to make some global deformations. So if I want to adjust this box, I have to right click and go into its components, and a lattice only has one type of component. Those are lattice points. And if we select these, you can see that it's making sort of a global change. Not a global change, but we're not just moving vertices around, we're moving groups of vertices around, and there's a fall off of the influence between these lattice points. So if we just go back into object mode here, select the lattice, we can see that it's got S, T, and U divisions, and those are like height, width, and depth. And you can change the number of divisions, but only before you've made any changes to the lattice. Now, I went to undo out of the changes I made, so I can go in and add more divisions. So 5, 5, 5, then we have more divisions, and then if I were to select one lattice point here, for example, the fall off would be much tighter. So it wouldn't be as far reaching, because it's only going to reach between the local lattice points. So if we just do 2 by 2, and then we're just making kind of a box around it that's going to deform it. So this can be useful if you've made a detailed model and then you realize you have to make some sort of global change to it. But if I want to preserve that change, for some reason, am I in B mode or something? It's pretty slow to react here. But let's say I want to preserve this change that I've made. I can select the model and go to Edit, Delete by Type, and if I delete History when there's a deformer on the object, it will delete the deformer but preserve its effect. Okay, so that's important to remember. I can undo out of that. If I want to delete the history on the object without deleting the deformer, then there's a delete non-deformer history as well. And if I just want to get rid of the deformer and its effects, we can select the deformer and delete it. Okay, so that's the lattice. It's quite useful for doing sort of global tweaks to your object. But then there are these set of nonlinear deformers. I'm just going to open up this menu set. So go to Deform Nonlinear, click on the top of this menu set, and it will pull off this. And there are things like bend, flare, sine wave, squash, twist, and wave. So bend does sort of what it says on the box. If I go into deform mode, you can see there's this line in the middle. This is called the deformer handle. If I click on the inputs here, there's curvature, and so I can change that, and you can see that it changes the object. So I'm using the virtual slider here. If I click on the name of something, an attribute in the channel box, and then middle mouse click in the scene, it acts like a virtual slider. So you can deform using these, and these handles can be moved up and down. Oops, sorry, I moved the model instead of the handle, which has its own interesting effect. But if I grab the handle on the inside and then move that up and down, you can see that it has a different effect on the model depending on how it's placed, how it's rotated. Okay, and we also have things. So curvature is obvious. It's the roundness of this bend here. Envelope is an on and off switch essentially, but it's a float variable, so it goes in fractions, so you can just dial in the amount of the effect, or you can animate this going off and on. The high bound and low bound, I'm just going to go into wireframe mode. So there's a middle point of the deformer, and then a high and then a low. And so the low bound, we can pull in the effects here, so you can see that it controls how it falls off. And then the high bound does the same thing, but in the top, so you can control how that deformer is having an effect on the object. I'm just going to delete that, and so it pops back to normal. And you can look at all these different ones. There's no point really in going through them, but like the sine wave, for example, will have, it's a sine wave, so it has an amplitude. It has a wavelength. And offset just allows it to go push through those values. So this is something you could animate if you wanted to make something sort of wiggling. It's got a high bound, low bound as well, and it's also got a drop off, so the effect will drop off from the middle out. Or maybe that's from the edges, from the middle towards the edges. I'm not really sure actually. But anyway, so if you wanted to preserve this effect, you select the object and you go to Edit, Delete by Type, History. The deformer is gone, its effects remain. If you want to get rid of its effects and go back to normal, select the deformer itself and delete it, and it will pop back to normal. Okay, and then the last one, and so I invite you to look at all these different ones, and they do kind of what they say. The last one that is quite useful, and I'm not going to use the head model for this, I'm just going to create a smoothed cube to make a non-polar sphere. So mesh, smooth, and maybe give it 4 divisions. So the last one is what's called a texture deformer, and this is actually quite useful. So if we go to deform and texture and open up the option box, so the point space are the object's UVs, so that's just based on the way you've got the surface laid out. We'll talk about UVs more later. The direction are along the object normals. What are object normals? Well, those indicate the direction of the outer part of the surface. So if I select this object and go to display polygons, face normals, you can see these little sticks pointing up, and these indicate the angle of the local surface. And it just this is what Maya uses to calculate how light interacts with the surface through reflections, refractions, and just local color and specularity and things like that. So we want this deformation, the texture, to deform the surface along these normals, sort of out from the surface. You can also do it from the handle or a certain vector, so you can say along the y-axis, so they're all pointing up or whatever. But normally you want the direction to be normal, strength, and so on. Okay, so we just create this and nothing seems to happen. But if we open the attribute editor and we have the texture deformer selected, here under texture we can actually add a texture. So if we click on the checkerboard here, it's going to open up what's called the create render node, or sometimes called the visor, and we can add a texture to this. Now typically we'd probably want to add a 2D texture, could be a 3D texture, but an easy one to use is something like a fractal pattern. Okay, and so you can see that this is the fractal pattern, so it's just a procedurally generated noise. using fractal values, and it's deforming the surface. And we can change these values to change the nature of that deformation, right? So you can go around and play with this to see what all these different things do, but it's a good way to add noise to an object like this. So just to go from a simple sphere to something with these deformations. Now if I go back into the texture deformer here and I right click on the name texture, I can break the connection and it gets rid of the link to that noise or that fractal. And I can click on the checkerboard again, and let's say this time I want to choose a 3D texture and I choose volume noise. And it will work much in the same way. There are more options with a volume noise. But you can play around with these things to get whatever effect it is that you want. And if I wanted to preserve this, now typically you just leave this hooked up. I think if I delete history, yeah, the texture deformer will be gone, just like any other texture. But you can leave that texture deformer on there so you could animate the values of whatever texture it was. And you can even smooth the model after by hitting 3 on the keyboard, and you can get something like this. Oh, went a little bit long, but those are 3 important types of textures, or pardon me, 3 important types of deformers that you can use in your modeling process.